Well, thank you very much, Marie. Not 100% convinced by the color of the pens you provided, but
I did. Sorry.
it's the details, you got to be careful on those. Yeah. Well, you can tell from the accent I'm a native-born Canadian, and in North America you generally start these things with a little bit of humor, so I was thinking, what can I start with? And given that the king left yesterday early in the morning, reminded me of the story about his dad, Prince Philip, who, when he was 96, this is true, he got into a car accident. He obviously didn't die in the car accident, but it was a pretty bad accident, so of course the BBC went up to interview him, and in the course of talking to him, they didn't just ask about the accident, they said, what would you like people to be saying about you in 100 years? What's your legacy? And Prince Philip looked at the reporter and said, well, I suppose what I'd like people to be saying about me in 100 years is something along the lines of, isn't it remarkable that he's still sexually active? I say that, by the way, as a committed constitutional monarchist because I'm an unemotional supporter, but my day job is constitutional law, and it just seems to me undeniable that the status quo is any alternative is worse. It just boils down to that. So if you're in the game of trading off those costs and downsides for what amounts to just a symbolic gesture, just seems to me to be steroidal virtue signaling, which I don't really like. As for the H.R. Nicholls Society, it's what we once would have called, possibly outside of Tasmania, a kissing cousin to the Samuel Griffith Society. So the great John Stone was a founding member of both societies, and they both go back over 3 decades. This one is a few years older, but there's the short hiatus. I have been on the board of the Samuel Griffith Society for 6 or 7 years. It's a privilege. It's focused on our Constitution and law. This one is focused on, as you know, economy, industrial relations. But I got here, my wife and I we arrived here from New Zealand in 2005. We've been all over Hong Kong, London, New Zealand here. My life motto is to stay one step ahead of extradition. And so we got here 19 years ago, and I joined the Samuel Griffith Society, and I just would see Ray Evans every year. He came to all the conferences. He was a really great guy, so that's my personal connection with him. I didn't really know anything about this organization. In fact, I'm the black sheep in my family. I'm a lawyer. My dad was an economist. My sister is an economist. I have 2 uncles who are economists. They look down on me for, understandable reasons. I grew up in a sort of Scots-Canadian Calvinist house where you'd just be yelling at each other every dinner. Nobody took it seriously. Everyone had a thick skin. So if there are any big business people in the room, I advise you to have a thick skin for what's coming in a minute. Last thing about me, I'm openly conservative, and I work in a G8 university. You have no idea how bad it is. It has gotten bad. Every single year it got worse since I've been here in 2005, and almost all of those were under coalition governments who were completely useless. Let me just say that on the record. When they tried to repair the universities, the coalition would go and talk to the vice chancellors. They are the problem. Why you would do that is beyond me, but just for those who don't know, donations to political parties, that's public information in the U.S., so you can go and look it up. And there was a law professor from Notre Dame, the American one, and he went through all the data. It must have taken forever. From 2018 to 2023, looking at the name of every law professor in the U.S., and the ratio of Democrats to Republicans in law schools in the U.S. is 36 to 1. That's under 3% for anyone who's a lawyer. And they say the left has taken over the culture institutions. They have. And they pretty much do it under Tory governments in Britain, coalition governments here. The identity politics obsessed DEI focus is, it's everywhere. And, basically what you do with that is you take a look at the statistical numbers in the wider population of, it's usually reproductive organs, skin pigmentation. And then, you take a look and see if some desired job has the same thing. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But DEI people actually drive conservatives out of institutions. It undermines viewpoint diversity. I mean, I turn on my computer every day to something about something I don't agree with. It'll be a transgender thing. It'll be a... I have never done an acknowledgement of country because it is such virtue signaling crap. And if you actually listen to it and you actually believe it, then you should be giving your house to these people because it's effectively patronizing, condescending, and it's implicitly saying that you have no legitimacy here. So I just don't understand how people do it all the time. But I had intended to finish this introductory part by saying that the business community at least is fighting back, but I tried and I couldn't do it with a straight face, so I just gave up on that. So here's what I'm going to do on my talk. First part is just going to be running through the dire state of this country's labor relations, productivity, sovereign risk, red tape, you name it. Really, really bad. And then I'm going to do a second thing, but as I said, before I do that, I'm going to just remind you again that I am an open conservative, and by that I pretty much mean that you could not put a piece of paper between my views and those of John F. Kennedy. He'd have more hookers in the White House than I would probably. But, you know, other than that, on just about every issue, we'd be the same. And that has got me labeled far right, hard right, extreme right. I was on ABC radio defending Tony Abbott. I kept getting called hard right, far right. And I said, wow, it's just, it's amazing. But, you know, I'm not a socialist. I've taught international law. I'm a free marketeer. I get comparative advantage. Most people don't. I don't like, you know, bureaucracy, red tape. But my second argument this afternoon is going to be that having gone through all the terrible economic problems in this country, I basically wouldn't lift a finger to help big business in this country, and I wouldn't do it for at least a term of coalition government if I were Peter Dutton. Big business simply doesn't deserve it, and I mean, some people have hinted at it today, but boy, they've been too nice. And so bluntness will be a bit of the order of the day. So I'm going to be telling some home truths to big business, because if you're an economist, you will know the great man Thomas Sowell. I met him once. Great. He once said, when you want to help people, you tell them the truth. When you want to help yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. And the problem with most right-of-center conservative governments around the Anglosphere is too many people are telling them what they want to hear, not what they really need to be told. So let's start with the dire state of affairs. I mean, say this in your sleep. The Albanese government gives every impression of wanting to hobble our agricultural center. Its intentions as regards the mining sector is worse. And this is despite big mining pretty much keeping the country afloat. As people have said today, they've changed labor relations laws to make them worse from what, you know, sort of barely half worked before. Canadians like me, when they get here, I got here in 2005, I was just staggered to learn that some two-bit pseudo-bureaucrat tribunals overseeing this basically unique 120-year-old, completely outdated labor law system, and that's the kindest way I can describe it, abandoned everywhere else. It was abandoned before I got to New Zealand in 1993. Well, you know, I was stunned to find out these tribunals have a hefty hand in deciding on and imposing wages and conditions. You know, thousands of pages of rigid rules that, as people have pointed out, the ABC can't comply with, the grocers can't comply with, charities can't. You pick your most left-wing employer, they can't comply with it. It's just, if you sat down to design a more productivity-killing system, you wouldn't be able to. And France, which is considerably more left-wing than here, they don't have it. I mean, it just seems crazy to me. I've never really understood how we haven't tried to get rid of it. And I know that, I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but we are pretty unique in the democratic world in having a strong upper house. No offense to people who are in the Senate, but as a Canadian, we don't have an upper house really. We have an unelected upper house, and the Brits have an unelected upper house. None of the provinces in Canada, they're all unicameral. And so the reason that New Zealand can just win an election and do stuff is because they don't have to get it through an upper house where you can get in if you're from Tasmania, if you're from an extended family with an unusual number of friends. You know, this is just a crazy, crazy setup, and And there's a sort of systemic bias against conservatives, because if you come in as an independent, you're always going to favor more government spending. And so Labour, to some extent, has an easier time getting stuff through. Meanwhile, Albo and the company think government spending is the only thing keeping us out of a recession, which makes you wonder why they don't go to 80% of GDP. This is in the context of 6 quarters of GDP per person decline. So think about that. That's a massive recession at the level of the individual, which is what matters. The level of Keynesian concern with GDP, which is one of the more bogus measurements in my view. GDP per person sort of is something we should care about, but this idea that we'll focus on this fictional idea of the entire economy and we can just up GDP by basically running the world's highest per capita immigration regime, which we are doing, that just seems nuts. And that's a term of art too. So we've got impoverishing inflation. I don't think we're as bad as the States. If you had $1 when Mr. Biden came into office, then today it's worth less than 80 cents. That's big inflation. We have electricity prices. I got here in 2005. They were the lowest in the democratic world. Today they're almost the highest. That's pretty change. That's a big change in 19 years. People have talked about NDIS. It's gone mad. And again, don't you notice they bring in the NBN, they bring in the NDIS, Labour, and then when we come in office, we don't do anything about it, ever. Woeful labour relations, terrible productivity. I can tell you about the education system, pretty much aims to indoctrinate. 5 years ago, we were just behind Kazakhstan. And then since COVID, we aspire to be just behind Kazakhstan, and our international results are really, really bad. One of the things I'm most proud about is that from day one, I have a weekly column in the Spectator Australia. I was against lockdowns. Firstly, if you really care about individual freedom, and Mr. O'Brien said the Liberals do, but that's just patently laughable, you would not throw away 100 years of data and a WHO plan and a British plan that a left-of-center government in Sweden followed that says don't lock down, in favor of aping what the Chinese Politburo was doing. You just wouldn't do it. And put on top of that, the data was clear from pretty early on, from the Diamond Princess and stuff, that there's about a 10,000 time difference between how the COVID affected young 20-year-olds. And the average age of death from COVID in almost every country is higher than the life expectancy. It is just simply untrue that we were all in this together. Biggest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, and from the young to the old ever. And it was just brought to you by Team Morrison. So that was bad. And what that did is it produced citizens. The lockdowns produced citizens who think they're entitled to work from home. Nobody believes that working from home is more productive than working from the office. There's no evidence for it at all. They think that government can just dole out money, the way Mr. Frydenberg did, who have been immunized against the huge costs of ever-increasing government spending. And, for many people, rightfully so, like me, just simply do not trust the elites. The 3 top 10 epidemiologists in the world, Professors Bhattacharya, Gupta from Oxford, she's probably the world's best, and Kuldorf, who was fired from Harvard, they wrote the Great Barrington Declaration. They were censored. People tried to get rid of their jobs. Here we are in Australia listening to a guy on ABC who was a general practitioner about 25 years ago and knows nothing. And so they said, Bhattacharya to this day says the biggest source of misinformation and disinformation during COVID was government. And I think that's right. I spent a lot of time, my first degree was in math, and I spent a lot of time looking at the data, and it's, I don't know what they were doing. So, that's bad. And by the way, these misinformation bills are shockingly bad. It is really, really bad. It's about the worst inroad on free speech I've seen. And of course, the first iteration came from the coalition, Paul Fletcher. I mean, what are they doing? Anyway, to sum up stage 1 then, I think Australia has excessive, oppressive regulations. To me, they look like they were designed and overseen by a battalion of busybody bureaucratic regulators. The truth about our IR system is that practically every employer has probably inadvertently broken the law at some point. who'd want to, I was going to say who would want to bet against the guess that the sum of the identified underpayments would be in the hundreds of millions, but having watched the presentations today, strike hundreds of millions and put in billions, I'm sure that's right, having looked at the presentations. The awards system is so complex, really, that no one understands it. Maybe a few people in this room. Almost impossible to comply with it properly. And again, no other democracy on earth has it. I mean, it's just, it seems to me very, very peculiar. So the real question is, why do we have this award system at all? My native Canada, where, you know, the median voter in Canada would be at least a standard deviation to the political left, to the median voter here in Australia. We go back to Canada, my wife and I, and it feels like, you know, people are so left-wing. You know, they make Albanese look like a center. So you're just going, and these are people we know. It's just, you know, bizarre. You're away long enough. So it's a considerably more left-wing country. But Canada isn't burdened by this archaic labor relations system. So these are sort of mysteries that surpass all human understanding. I will take issue with something that was said earlier this morning about work choices. So I'm a federalist. By that I mean I think you get better results when if you have a big country where you divide up power and you leave things to the lower level lander, canton, states, provinces. The empirical evidence for this, by the way, is massive. Germany, Switzerland, the US, Canada, they do better than centralized states. Australians, I generalize, are massive centralists. They don't seem to get that federalism delivers more preferences, and it also, if you get a competition between the lower level states, you get better outcomes. You know, John Howard, I was a big fan of his, I still am, but he was a centralist. And, you know, the idea that it's good to have one school curriculum for the whole country rests on the assumption that the government's going to pick a really good school curriculum. Now, why anyone would think that on the right side of politics is absolutely belong. You know, Canada has 10 different school curricula, and some of them are terrible, but you know what? Alberta has one of the best school curricula in the world. And if you go down, if you buy into one size fits all, the odds are you're going to end up, it's not going to be good. And this is what happened in work choices. I know for a fact that some of the cabinet ministers around the table, I mentioned no names, but one rhymes with Kinchin, you know, were highly against this. And work choices legislation was good from our point of view. But the problem was, if you have any foresight at all, once you centralized, and don't get me started on the High Court should never have allowed it. It was a terrible decision. You know, our top court has destroyed federalism in this country since the engineers case. Basically, the people who are on the losing side of the constitutional debates outlived everyone else, got onto the High Court, and then they just rewrote the Constitution when it came to federalism. But, you know, that work choices case, when you get Callanan and Kirby dissenting together, this never happens, right? There's something going on here. And it was a terrible decision. You've got referenda trying to give the power to the center. They always failed. They were specifically not given to the center, and then you get it under the corporation's power. It's not quite as bad as Tasmanian Dam, where you can just sort of do whatever you want as long as you enter into a treaty. I mean, we've just destroyed it in this country. But we would be better off if Howard had never brought in work choices, because as soon as Labour comes in, they are going to use this new power to take us back to the Stone Age. If we had not done anything, it would be at the state level, and we had a more liberal setup then. And the problem with centralists is they just assume, here's the test. You make the law and then assume the political party you hate is going to be able to use that same power. You know, it's not rocket science. But of course, there's many, many great things about Australia. One of my favorite is that you cannot change this constitution without asking the people. That's not true in Canada. It's not true in the US. You know, and if that weren't the case, we would be much worse off. But I don't think that anyone with a straight face could say that Australia right now has, you know, conditions that are hospitable for establishing new businesses or, you know, turning around the terrible state of our productivity. So that's stage one. I agree with all the diagnoses that we've heard today, especially of the IR laws. So now it's time for stage two. And this is where I tell people in this room why my opinion is that despite those horror stories, big businesses don't deserve any help for at least a term from a future coalition government. So why would I not lift a finger to help any of the big business end of town? Well, you've got to start with the just absolutely disgraceful behavior of our corporate elites during the voice referendum. I did not think it was possible that nearly the entirety of the corporate managerial class would openly take sides on a party political referendum, constitutional referendum. I don't know if that happening anywhere else. It would never happen. So it wasn't one where both parties were aligned. You had a party political referendum, right? And the corporate elites take sides on this. And to be clear, to show you how extraordinary it was, the business elites took the side of the left-wing Labour government, the party that's, making our labour relations more sclerotic, that pushes productivity-killing regulations, that hampers new mines from coming into being, that's a bigger spender than the already huge spending coalition. And, basically, Labour's been on the wrong side of all economic and labour relations calls, and that's the side that our country's corporate elites throw their lot in with. They didn't stay neutral. That would have been perfectly acceptable, wholly appropriate and fine. They took the side of a proposal, and I'm a constitutional, in my view, it was the worst referendum proposal in this country's history. So, to be clear, it did inject race or differential treatment based on your genetic history or differentiation by ancestry, if you want to quibble about, race, because race is scientifically, incoherent. But you were going to reward people based on their ancestry. It did inject that into the Constitution. It did, not least by giving this a separate chapter in the Constitution, make very, very likely future judicial activism by a top court that is, it's already activist by Australian standards. And it's probably, between us, the least able high court in this country's history. And I know a lot of barristers agree with me. They just can't say it because that's how they make their living. And yes, it did inject a massive amount of, scleroticism, or it will be very, very hard to pass new laws for conservatives. Why would you support that as business? I don't know. Into our constitutional arrangements. And as I said, we already have some of the most sclerotic lawmaking sort of setup in the democratic world. There's only 3 countries with a strong upper house. Us, we copied the Americans. So the Americans, you'd rather be a senator than in the house there. And Italy. And Italy's been trying to get rid of their strong upper house for eons. So we already find it hard to pass law, and I know people go, the Senate's there to protect us, but it doesn't do a really very good job. So I don't have a problem with unicameralism. And yes, it did. If it got through, it was going to create a world of rent-seeking by Aboriginal activists. And yes, it did hope to empower the sort of activists from Canberra and not the outback Aborigines. And, I debated that for a whole year. I spent a lot of time doing it last year, including... the lawyerly cast was even worse than the business class. So not a thing the no side said, in my view, could plausibly be characterized as disinformation or misinformation, despite the laughable attempt, the rearguard action by some of the yes people, the senior yes people now trying to run that. But whatever side you're on the debate, let's be clear what our corporate elites did. They used not their own money, spend your own money how you want. They use shareholders' money to push the woke, progressive, wrong-headed yes side of a debate that split the 2 main political parties. Given the final vote was 61-39, more or less, it's almost certain that the majority of individual shareholders, leave aside, the big institutional ones, so you've got a majority of shareholders who would have disagreed with their company's CEOs and boards who took these decisions. And it's almost certain that the majority of the workforce did too. So the big corporate players, spend your own money as you want. But what sort of world sees Qantas paint yes decals on its planes and fly yes proponents around the country for free, but not no? And all while giving millions to the yes side. The Ramsay Foundation, which gave the yes side a high watermark of $7 million, and I know it's a charity, but this decision would have had Paul Ramsay turning in his grave. Woolworths gave $1 million, and then they subjected shoppers to basically North Korean type, pumped in propaganda while you're trying to shop until, the pushback was huge. So I don't know, for a few weeks. Also giving $1 million to the yes camp was NAB, the Commonwealth Bank, Telstra. ANZ opted to be really generous and give $2.5 million. Wesfarmers gave $2 million. I could just go on and on and on. These are the elites of the corporate managerial class. These are the people who now are going to want to knock on the door of a newly elected Dutton government and ask it to expend capital for them. You know, why in the world would they do that? I mean, I don't claim that liberal governments are brave by any means, but you know, my first degree was in math. I sort of understand game theory, and in no universe would it point to rewarding that sort of corporate virtue signaling that happened during the Voice. Now, you could say it wasn't just virtue signaling, it verged on crony capitalism. If you attribute at least a sort of non-virtue signaling motive to some of these people, you might say, you know, they wanted to get on the good side of a Labour government because they perceived it was likely to be in office for 2 or 3 terms, and, you know, their advisors were so naive and insulated and basically unable to drive out of inner city environs that they were sure the Voice was going to pass, and they made that calculation. Well, you know, there are consequences. The Business Council supported, yes. The vast preponderance of the lawyerly cast, and believe me, lawyers are the most, I don't want to use the word woke loosely, but what the hell? You know, in terms, people have this view that lawyers are conservative, and that was, you know, this is the view of what the lawyerly cast was like 40 or 50 years ago. Again, public information in the U.S. donations, let me tell you, at least a standard of deviation or more to the political left of the median voter. If you want the most sort of identity politics obsessed woke workplaces, pick your favorite big law firm in Sydney or Melbourne and just go in. I was talking to someone at the break, and some of the men's washrooms at an unnamed big law firm have, you know, Tampax dispensers in the male's washroom. You know, I mean, what are they doing? Who knows what to say about that? So I do take a little bit of immodesty in saying that I think I was the first person in print to say that the Voice proposal would lose. I said that when it was at about 68% yes, because basically the details, to the extent we were given them, were awful. And I knew average Australians would work it out over time. And remember, there was a massive no vote, even though the yes side massively outspent the no side. The entire legacy media, almost entirely, was completely in the bag for yes. For at least 7 or 8 months, Albanese would not give tax-deductible status to donations to the no side, but he gave it to the yes side. I mean, you know, they had every celebrity not in the grip of dementia, and a few that were. They came out for yes, and still it got slaughtered. I mean, what else do you need? It got slaughtered worse than Brexit. This tells us that our business elites, you know, these people, you know, are making big sides. They don't look like they're all that bright. So they took sides on a tremendously important constitutional issue and against the side of politics that, you know, normally supports them, at least voices that they will. And they got the effrontery now to want to use up, to ask the Liberal government to use up some of their political capital. You know, it would be much, much easier for a future coalition government to just focus on helping small and medium-sized businesses, reduce their regulatory burden, and just leave big business to pay the costs of what they did. And, you know, not everything in life is reciprocity and tit for tat, but a lot of things are. And, you know, it so infuriated me that I just stopped flying Qantas. I stopped shopping at Woolworths. Kohl's isn't much better, but little. And I did basically everything I could not to give money to these people who were, it's basically cheap and easy virtue signaling because you're not spending your own money. Alan Joyce had a lot of money. He could have given a lot of money to the yes side of his own pocket. So I'll leave the Voice. Just take it from me that I was heavily involved with both of the main no campaigns, and there is a simmering, visceral anger at what happened, not just at the corporate elites, at the legal elites and everyone else, but it's there. And I'm not sure everyone in this sort of room has a sense of just how angry people are. So that's going to take a while to wither away. I got a few minutes left. I'll talk about the whole, DEI industry. Diversity, equity, inclusion. I mentioned it before. Let me be blunt. It's just thinly disguised affirmative action. So it's directly in conflict with any merit-based view of the world. You know, how employment and tertiary education opportunities ought to be doled out. I'll explain in a minute, but here's what it does. Basically, as I mentioned, you start with a statistical fact about the world. So what's the percentage of people out there with this sort of reproductive organs, this skin pigmentation, you know, the ancestors who were in this country for the longest, whatever. And then you look at some highly desirable job, corporate board positions or, university scholarships. And notice it's always highly desirable jobs. No one ever says 95% of people who die on the job are men, which is a fact. And so, what we really need to do is we need to get more women in these jobs so they can die, so we can get a statistical balance, because that's what we want. We want proportional deaths on the job. What a ridiculous thing to say, right? So you only focus on desirable positions, and then you look at the hit rates of who gets these desirable jobs and whether it lines up perfectly in some one-to-one way with the statistical fact about the wider population. And if you don't find a one-to-one correlation, there is only one explanation that's ever allowed: discrimination. Now, empirically, that's false as an explanation for why you have this imbalance, but that's the only explanation that's allowed. So you never are allowed to point out that, liberals tend to focus on the individual, and individuals have different sentiments, and they have different abilities and different likes, right? And that sort of thing can drive different outputs. No, if the statistical percentages don't match up, then the group right social engineers kick in and they say it has to be discrimination. And why we give in to that is beyond me. And of course, that's just identity politics. It only works by seeing the world in terms of groups, as if everyone with the same reproductive organs has the same views about everything, which is nonsense. And, as I said, it's implausible as a matter of fact. And it's also arbitrary. It's founded on raw arbitrariness, because the groups you select are wholly arbitrary. I mean, why women? Why, people with a certain kind of skin pigmentation? Why aren't we looking at the percentage of Christians who are corporate board members? Or those who served in the military, or heaven forbid, white working class men who have some of the worst statistics in the US economically of any group. The groups you choose is a purely political choice, and then you demand that the only explanation for breaching group statistical outcome ratios is discrimination, which requires you to see the world in terms of oppressor and oppressed implicitly. We all know where that comes from. So you don't see the world in terms of individuals, you see it in terms of group, and it fundamentally undermines the notion of merit. And big companies have completely caved in. It's almost as if they were the Canberra Public Service. And if you don't think that long-term undermines productivity, then you and I don't agree. So you can't have both. You can't have policies that reward merit, which is what I assume most people who have an outlook as long as the benefits of merit-based hiring and merit-based rewards are largely shared with the wider population, when people come up with new inventions, or, high tech comes in and comes up with new, that trickles down, then you want to hire based on merit. You can't have merit and also what is implicitly basically just group quotas. I say it's not quotas, but anyone who pretends DEI doesn't deal in unofficial quotas is just a liar. They're so self-deluded that they could probably have a career in politics. Again, you can't have those DEI policies and also hire based on merit. You can't. And so they have to do mental gymnastics. So my last grievance here this afternoon is that, in my view, corporate Australia has sold its soul to the DEI identitarians who, now people, their HR department. I've had senior law firm partners tell me, well, I can't do that because of the HR department. Hello? You're the partners. This, by the way, is all part of the left-wing takeover of our cultural institutions. And, as I said, big corporations on this front look as, basically as bad as the Canberra Public Service. And if that's not a mark of shame, I really don't know what is. So in the US, we're seeing some fight back against DEI. The legislatures in some US states have legislated the total disbanding of the entire DEI bureaucracies of their public state universities. So, and that has saved tens and tens of millions of dollars per annum with no change to the sort of quality of the universities. In fact, often it's better. The guy a few years back who wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs, and the basic definition of a bullshit job is if you get rid of it, either no one notices the difference or things go better. And that's DEI. And if you don't believe me, this is a state that hasn't got rid of it. The University of Michigan, really good public university in the US, Well, for 2022, 2023, I had a DEI payroll that came in at 18 million. That's just the people you're paying in the university to run these programs. That increased to 30 US million for 23, 24. And that's a careful study by some guy named Mark Perry that came out a few weeks ago. 132 full-time diversity employees in 22, 23 shot up to 300. That's a 66% increase for the lawyers. Worse, if that's possible, more than 500 positions at the University of Michigan in some way or other were charged with advancing DEI. It's just relentless propaganda. If you work at a university, Australia is just as bad. That's what some other U.S. states have legislatively outlawed, and it's those sort of savings that they've brought about. And even some U.S. companies have now gotten rid of their DEI branch. I think to a large extent in the U.S. it was driven by that Bud Light saga, which you will all know about, but it's cost Bud Anheuser-Busch billions of dollars in market capitalization. And so you do that and you don't affect the core business one whit. So unfortunately, we all know that corporate Australia has gone down this path. Don't get me started, as I said, on the big law firms. Anyway, it's just, these policies lower productivity. Various studies that show that they do. Leave aside that, as I said, DEI has an inherent bias to the political left because, conservatives don't want to see the world in terms of groups. They want to see it in terms of individuals. And I mean, one of the political speakers earlier just today was talking about the great commitment of the Liberal Party to freedom and individualism. Not really, not based on fact. I'd like to think they did, but they don't really. Let's hope they do again. But again, if you are prepared to spend that kind of money as a corporation on DEI policies, why would a future right-of-center Dutton government expend political capital to help with the country's woeful productivity? I don't know. That was a rhetorical question. Let me finish with a joke that some of you have heard, but most of you haven't. Where is our president? Frank was walking down the beach. He was up the Gold Coast, and he stumbles on this old Arabic bottle, and he picks it up, and he inadvertently rubs it, and Jeannie comes out. Frank says, "Oh, do I get 3 wishes?" So she's sort of Barbara Eden-like. She looks at him, she goes, "Well, you do get 3 wishes, Frank, but I'm a very special genie, so everything you ask for, every single person who works in DEI in Australia will get 2. So remember that. Whatever you want, they're going to get twice as much, every single one." So, Frank says, "Well, for my first wish, then I'd like $1 million. So she blinks her eyes. She says, "Check your bank account. But remember, every single DEI person in Australia who works in that realm, they have $2 million. What's your second wish?" And Frank thinks, and he goes, this is pretty implausible given the crowd here, but he goes, "I'd like a top-of-the-line German sports car." So he blinks her eye. She says, "Go home. In your driveway, you'll see a top-of-the-line BMW. But remember, every single DEI person in Australia will have 2 of those cars. So what's your third and final wish?" Frank, he's a canny fellow. He thinks for a minute. He goes, "I've always wanted to donate a kidney." Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, I was going to ask are there any questions for the professor this afternoon? Yeah, we've got one here and one over here.
I'll give you this, Mary. I can't really carry it around. The color's not right.
I'm really sorry. That's cool.
Yeah.
James, excellent talk. Thank you. Can you just refer to when you talked about lots of people being agitated about the Voice and the debacle and waste of time and money that was, who are you actually referring to?
Well, almost all the people who were in the no camp, and they looked at all these elites, spending huge amounts of their money to push the yes camp. And, it was really annoying to see what the big corporations were doing and how the government was fudging. I didn't even go through all the ways in which the government was fudging, and including having the Electoral Commission say that, a tick would be okay, but a cross would not be okay. I don't know what intellectual sort of gymnastics you have to go through on that one. but that's what they said. And so, I mean, I think largely the lack of trust in the sort of elites in society was happening before COVID, but it got massively accelerated because basically the doctor we cast and the press, and it was the most incurious press ever. They just got everything wrong. When we look back on, and so you think, why would I listen to anything they say? Pretty much a problem.
Just a quick follow-up from your position as a constitutional lawyer. Would you agree with the idea that we won the battle, lost the war, in terms of the Yes campaigners continue on at the state level at least, and they've just gone round the loss and continue to complain, and they haven't stopped, whereas the no people have stopped, they've moved on to other issues.
I agree that they're continuing on, but if had this passed, it would have been a disaster. So it would have been way worse. I mean, literally, because make representations was unclear, it would have gone to the High Court, and we wouldn't know until the judges spoke, activist judges. We wouldn't know how much input you would have to ask, and we wouldn't know what an acceptable level of deference. So it wasn't a veto, but it was pretty close to a veto, and it wasn't, they didn't direct it just at Parliament, it was at also the executive, which meant that every single ministry arguably would have to have done this. It was just a nightmare proposal, and so we avoided that, and that would have been just completely awful. So nothing would have been as bad as that. I'm not really sure what it means for a subcomponent part of a country to make a treaty. I mean, treaties are between states, and so when Victoria says they're going to have a treaty, I'm not even sure what that means. I don't know what the status is. It seems weird. Maybe Neil has some idea. But, okay, so Victoria makes this. So treaties are normally made between, nation states, or if you go back long enough, between, empires, whatever. So what is the status going to be? I don't know. You can always withdraw from a treaty, so there's nothing stopping a future Victorian coalition government. Well, nothing stopping it except for the lack of a backbone. But so, once it evolves into being a vertebrate from an invertebrate, nothing stops them from withdrawing from any treaty that Labour goes. You can't lock in a treaty, right? So it doesn't really matter what Labour does. They could just come in and say it's gone. We're getting out of it. They won't. They're too busy deciding what a woman is at the state level. But once they've decided what a woman is, they might be in a better position to do things like a treaty.
Thank you. That was excellent. On your curriculum points, should there be any centralised national or state curriculum, or should it be fully decentralised to each school, such as there is competition then between the schools? What's your view on that? Well,
it's a hypothetical, because Australia never retreats from centralising. I mean, the only thing I ever agreed with Turnbull on, I always thought if your answer to Tony Abbott is Turnbull, you've got a real problem. The problems with Abbott, but Turnbull, the one thing Turnbull did is he actually offered the states income tax power. It lasted about 3 days. And then you have to go back to Fraser before. And, the thing is, if the states had their own income tax power, then they would be accountable for the decisions they made. We have basically a Marxist system. So what you do is you have the GST, and then you have this formula, and the formula is so opaque that you have to have solved Fermat's last theorem to understand it, which is one person. Yeah, okay. Right. Well, the thing is, though, that some of the criteria include, not wanting. If you don't allow development of your gas fields, then you get money from states that do allow it. Now, so this set of incentives are just flat out bizarre. And you sort of equalize the states that are doing badly, equalize up with the state. Well, if you had your own income tax, the way, in Canada, provinces set their own income tax. And people seem to think I'll pay, the 50% marginal rate plus. That's not how it works. Let's just say that on day one, you move to a system, and I'm just arbitrarily making up numbers. Let's say the feds took 28% and 22% went to the states. Well, the day after, the states are free to raise or lower that as they see fit, and you get competition. So in many U.S. states, out of 50, I think there's 8 or 9 that have no state income tax, right? Florida, Alaska, I could get 8 if I had time. Some have low, some have high. Same in Canada. So if you go to Alberta, you pay almost no provincial income tax. Everyone pays the same And you get competition. And if you want to live in a low tax province or state, you can. And if you want to go to a high provision, high tax, and they're not really that high provision, go to Ontario and Quebec have very high provincial taxes. And over time, you get this competition. You know, the main benefits of federalism are twofold. One, you get competition. Anyone who talks about cooperative federalism is not someone who is either lying to you or doesn't know what he's talking about. There are no benefits from cooperative federalism. They're all from competition. And secondly, you know, the idea of delegating decisions down to a lower level is that you satisfy more preferences. You know, the one Scalia always talked about is take something like prostitution in the US. If you regulate at the national level, you're going to have 51-49 outcome. 49% of the population can be mad. If you delegate it down to the states, well, you're going to get, you know, very liberal outcomes in New York, California, you know, the West Coast. And you're going to get, you know, much more conservative outcomes in the South and maybe a bit of the Midwest. And you might get 75% of people are happy with the regulation in their state. Not everyone, you know, there can be people in Austin, Texas who don't like Texas, people in upstate New York, but you satisfy more preferences. And the thing is, if you want federalism, you cannot be someone who says, I want one size fits all outcomes across the whole country. As soon as you say that, you're not a federalist. Federalism means differences and competition. And what you do is you go, look, in our state, we've come last in education the last 8 years. Maybe we have to copy, you know, it's hard to pick which state here would even have a good education system, but, you know, let's say WA is doing pretty well. Maybe we should look at their curriculum because, you know, we keep coming 5 places behind Kazakhstan. Well, that's out the window now. When you have a national curriculum, it's just, there's no impetus to change anything. The IPA does good work in pointing out that the curriculum could have been written by Mr. Nicholls, but leaving that aside, there's not a lot of impetus. So that's, I would like to think that Mr. Howard regrets some of his centralizing decisions because he got a lot right, but he sure didn't, in my view, he didn't get those right.